Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.
Hi, and welcome to In the Garden. I'm Bryce Lane. And folks, we're going to take our next two shows and devote them to a gardening topic that we all have lots of questions about. That's right, we're going to talk all about pruning. We'll talk about when the best time to prune is, we'll talk about why you should prune, and a number of other pruning topics. But first, we need to ask this question: what is pruning? Well, before we actually talk about how to prune, there are a number of different things about pruning we need to talk about first. And really, one of the reasons why pruning is often done too much or too little is because we don't actually consider these other aspects of pruning. So the first part of pruning that I'd like to talk about is what is pruning. Think about it. Pruning is defined technically in most horticultural texts as plant part removal. Anytime you're taking a piece of a plant off that plant, that's considered pruning. Harvesting fruit from a particular plant, perhaps taking cuttings for propagation. Of course, we often think about pruning as taking stems and leaves off of plants, and that's technically true. The real reason to ask is, why are we doing that? So now we've got the definition of pruning solved, let's look at the next aspect, the basics of pruning. Folks, please try to remember this in this show and the next show when we talk about pruning. Always remember that for every pruning cut you make, there is a specific growth response. Pruning can be done, but it's often going to stimulate certain kinds of growth responses. So when we prune, we really need to be thinking about the nature of the cut that we're making and how that's going to manifest itself in the way that the plant grows. Now, if you're a little bit confused, work with me on this. For instance, if you look here in my sunroom, I've got a nice ficus tree growing, and the environment is so conducive for its growth that every year it tends to grow right up into the vaulted ceiling and up in around the skylight. And so once a year, I do an annual pruning. I take the plant outside, wash it off, repot it, and then I go ahead and prune it. When I prune it, the way that I prune it is going to influence the type of growth response that I'm going to get. And what I want to get is a good, evenly distributed growth response. Second, look at the pruning that's been done at this particular residence. This is a weeping cherry. Someone has decided to go ahead and prune it such that the branches don't come down and hit this nicely manicured lawn. Now, some of you may think this looks pretty good and ornamental, but I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that this tree has lost its natural habit in having it pruned that way. Not only that, the way it was pruned, it's going to stimulate more growth and more actually profuse growth downward. Now, if you look in the foreground, take a look at those shrubs. Is that the natural habit of the shrub? I don't think so. We really need to think about what we do relative to pruning and the kind of growth response that the plant gets. So the next question to ask is, why prune? What are good reasons for pruning? And I've just put together a list, and we'll actually look at some examples later on. 1, size control. Number one reason why people prune is to reduce the size or control the size of a particular plant. 2, to shape in unnatural forms. Now, that might not be logical, but that's a good reason why a lot of people prune, is to shape in an unnatural form. Those gumdrops around the house really are an example of an unnatural form. 3rd, to eliminate hazards. Sometimes plants are thorny or spiny, and they need to be pruned to eliminate that hazard from passers-by or people in the family, etc. Eliminate structural problems. Oftentimes plants have certain structural problems that, if let to grow, they create problems. And so we prune to eliminate some of those structural problems. Lastly, remove the 4 Ds. Folks, if you don't remember anything about today's show, remember the 4 Ds of pruning. You do that first before you do any other kind of pruning. Of course, you're asking, what are the 4 Ds? 4 Ds of pruning. Very quickly, look something like this. Dead. First thing we remove are dead branches. Before we remove anything that's alive, the first D is dead. Second, Damaged tissue. If there's a branch that's been broken, it's not dead yet, but it's been broken, maybe we remove that damaged tissue secondly. Third, diseased. If we have pieces of a plant that are infected with insects or are diseased, we remove those pieces before we remove anything that's healthy. Have you guessed the fourth? The fourth is one of my favorite, and that's deranged. Oftentimes there are branches and plants that are growing in the wrong direction. They're growing in the direction that's different than all the other branches. It's real important to remove those branches because structurally they could create some problems. I maintain that if you approach pruning by removing the dead, damaged, diseased, and deranged branches first, 80 to 90% of your pruning will already be finished before you do any other kind of pruning. So there you have it. Looking at the reasons why we prune, and don't forget the 4 Ds of pruning. Well, now as we begin to take a look at some of the reasons for pruning and actually demonstrate them, folks, remember, pruning is not only a physical activity, but it's a mental activity. You've got to use your head and really think about what you're doing, because once you've cut, you can't put that piece back. It just never works. Now, the first reason for pruning we talked about was size control. And, you know, sometimes size control is a necessary evil. And what I mean by that is, take this shrub, for instance. It has gorgeous red flowers in the spring, and I've really decided that I want it to be here in the garden. And so that means that I'm going to have to prune it because it's overgrowing its space. So I'm going to come in and go ahead and begin pruning branches and reducing that size. And it doesn't take very long to begin to see that you can get some good size control just by taking out some of the branches. Now, some of you may be wondering about the actual technique I'm using for pruning. You need to stay tuned. Next week, in next week's show, we're going to talk about the different types of pruning cuts and the actual how-to. But anyway, the first reason for pruning, and for good reason, is size control. And you can see already in just this short period of time, I've already reduced the size of this shrub, and that's something I'm committed to doing on a regular basis. Well, now another reason for pruning is to eliminate hazards. Now, what do I mean by eliminating hazards? Excuse me. That's what I mean by eliminating hazards. This is a branch on a Japanese maple that's pretty low growing, and it's growing out into the path where people walk up. Well, that's a hazardous thing. You could walk up and poke your eye or hurt yourself. Could you imagine if this particular tree was a thorny tree? That would represent a real big hazard. So we really need to use good techniques of pruning to remove these kinds of hazards. So what I'm going to do is follow the branch all the way back to where it's connected to another branch, which is right here, and I'm going to go ahead and remove that branch like that. Now I've removed the branch, we'll move it out of the way, and you can see how much easier it will be now for people to pass through this path. No hazards at all. Fabulous thing to do, eliminate hazards by pruning. Some plants, and specifically trees, often have what we call structural problems. And that's a good reason to prune out some of those structural problems. Now, a perfect example is what we call the crotch angle, and we talked about this in the show previous. And that has to do with the angle of the branch that's growing out from the main trunk. If that angle is narrow, then that results in a potential problem in that that represents a weakness where if any weight gets on that branch, it could break out. Classic example is Bradford pear, where after a thunderstorm or an ice storm, those crotch angles are so weak that breaks out. Now, you can't go prune out all the weak crotch angles, but you could identify some that could pose some problems. So a perfect example would be to go ahead and prune all the way back to where that crotch angle is. Something like this. Here's a narrow crotch angle, and I'm going to go ahead and prune right here and remove that potentially problematic branch later on as that branch gets larger. Now we don't have to worry about that structural problem. We need to be selective, though, when we choose those different types of branches that we're going to take out. Well, now the last logical reason for pruning is to remove the 4 Ds: dead, damaged, diseased, and deranged. And what I'd like to do right in this canopy of Japanese maple is to demonstrate those 4 Ds. Now, the first D is dead, and what you need to do is look inside the plant and see branches that are dead. And the way you look for that is you look for branches that don't have any leaves on them. Here's one right here where it's completely devoid of foliage, and so I'm going to go and just cut that off. And sure enough, that's a dead branch. There's another one back here, cut that off. And so the first thing to do is go through and isolate the dead branches and remove them. And that helps clean up the inside of the canopy. Now the second D is damaged. You've got to go in and look for damaged branches. Now you're not going to have as many damaged branches as you would dead branches, but after a storm you might see a damaged branch somewhere. And I just happened to notice there's a broken branch right here where it's been broken. So it would be important to go back and remove it past the point of its break and remove it there. So there's an example of removing a damaged branch. Now, the fourth D is diseased. And I'm looking through here and I don't see any marked diseases or insect infections, but if you were to find something like that, that would be the next D to remove, the diseased or infected branches. And the last D is the one that everyone is a little bit concerned about, and that's deranged. And folks, what you need to do is look at the tree and see how the branches are generally growing. Find those branches that are growing in positions that are opposite of that. And I think I found one right over here. If you look at this branch right here, it's growing back in toward the middle of the tree, whereas all the other branches are growing back out toward the outside. So by definition, that's a deranged branch, and I'll come in and I'll remove it. Now, come to find out, it was a pretty big branch, but that's okay because that opens up the canopy and allows for light transmission as well. So those are the 4 Ds: dead, damaged, diseased, and deranged. If you prune those out, you're in good shape for pruning before you've ever started to do any other kind of pruning there. Well, now that we understand why to prune, before we talk about any of the other aspects of pruning, it's really important to look at pruning tools. I know a lot of you have questions about what are the best tools to use for pruning and which tool is the appropriate tool to use for a particular pruning cut. So let's start with a hand pruner. The hand pruner is by far the most essential tool that we need to have if we're thinking about pruning. Strongly recommend that if you're going to spend some money on pruners, spend it on a pair of hand pruners. This particular hand pruner here is a unique type. It's actually the best type of pruner that you can get, and that is a pruner that has what's called a scissor cut, if you will, where this particular blade right here is a cradle, and it cradles the branch, and then the blade at the top comes down and cuts it. All right? Now, that's the basic type of pruner. You can get a number of different types of brands, etc., that you can use for a hand pruner. Let me show you another type if you're going to be doing a lot of pruning. All right, this pair of pruners right here has a smaller blade. Now you can get this style in a larger blade as well, but you can see it's got kind of a smaller blade, and it works on that very same principle. But I want you to look at the handle, and the bottom handle actually is loose. And you see how that rotates? Now you might think, well, that would be kind of an irritation. But folks, if you're going to do a lot of pruning, you cradle that with that movable handle, and as you see when I squeeze, you see how my fingers rotate? This is much more ergonomic when it comes to lots of use, and you won't hurt your hand as much. But this is really if you're going to be doing a lot of pruning. I like the other pruners better myself. These are a little bit small for my hand. But they're your hand pruners. Now, for smaller pruning like houseplants and bonsai, you'll see we have a number of unique kinds of tools that are more like scissors. And this is a pair of bonsai pruners. You can see there's no spring action. You move that blade back and forth with your own fingers. But this is for very fine type of pruning. Okay, now, a lot of times, a lot of people ask us relative to hand pruners how big a branch should be before we have to move to a different type of pruner. In other words, what's the size of branch that would work here? Well, I'm not going to give you any dimensions. Really what I want to do is demonstrate. If you can take your pruners and put it on a branch and with one hand very easily cut that branch off, then you know you've got the right size of pruner. But if you have your hand pruners and you want to cut a branch that's a little bit bigger, let's say we want to cut the branch right here, and we can't cut it with one hand. We've got to take a second hand and put it on there, and then we've got to start twisting and turning it, and maybe even trying to move our body to get leverage to cut. I call that the pruning dance. Well, then you know that branch is a little bit too big for the hand pruners. Folks, don't damage your pruners by trying to cut branches that are too big. The major rule of thumb is to just use one hand, squeeze it, and if it cuts, that's what you use. So you may be saying, well, how am I going to cut that branch right there? You need to move to the next type of pruner. The next type of pruner is called the lopper or the lopping shears. And that's characterized by this particular tool right here. This is a lopper. You'll notice that it has the typical pruning blade like you would on a pair of hand pruners and these long handles. Now that gives you leverage. Not only does it give you leverage, it gives you reach. So with loppers you get leverage and reach. It's a great pair of pruners to have. You get leverage from the long handles, and you also get reach. So you can reach up without getting on a ladder, or you can reach in and get those branches in a thickety shrub and whatnot. But now the same test goes for the size of branch on this pruner. Take that spot where we were going to prune with the hand pruners and it was too big. If we take the lopping shear and we go right here, you'll notice that it prunes relatively easily right there, and so that would be an appropriate size. Conversely, if we wanted to prune, say, at a thicker branch area, and we go to prune and we have to move our pruners back and forth, and we have to do that pruning dance again, well then this particular pruning tool is not appropriate for that branch at that size. So the loppers work real well, but if it's a bigger branch, you've got to go to the next tool. What's the next tool? Well, the next tool is the pruning saw. Now the pruning saw, you can get a number of different types of pruning saws. The ones I like are the ones that are specifically made for pruning. I'll show you why in a second. The pruning saw, this particular pruning saw, opens up like a jackknife. See? And so now you've got a hand pruner, a saw, where there's a little piece here to cradle your hand. And what's unique about this particular saw is it cuts on the pull stroke, not on the push stroke. Now that's very unique, folks, because if you're pruning above ground on a ladder or up in a tree and you have to reach far to prune, if it cuts on the push stroke, you could lose your center of gravity. So you definitely want to use these kinds of saws because you keep your center of gravity toward yourself, and that helps give you balance. But this is a great pruner. The other kind of pruning saw that I recommended is the one that you'll find in a holster. This is a cradle. You can pull it out. You can see it's a little bit bigger, doesn't fold, but it's the same principle. It cuts on the pull stroke, and that gives you that center of gravity and that balance that you so desperately need when you're pruning, especially if you're on a ladder. And folks, one thing about ladders and pruning, never take a ladder like a long extension ladder and place it up against a tree. I know it's awful tempting, but that's a very dangerous thing. Ladders need to be put up against flat surfaces and not trees. Okay, now, you might be thinking, well, this is great, but what about up in the air? I need to prune and I can't get up in the air because of a ladder and whatnot. Well, then there are what we call the pole pruners. And there's actually two different types. Let me show you. The basic pole pruner is a 10 to 20 foot pole. And this, I've just brought the first extension, not both extensions, but it allows you to get almost 15 to 20 feet up into the tree. You put the extension on the bottom. Of course, you hold it up over your head. And it has a rope, and the rope is connected to basically a lopping shear at the top, and it's hinged in such a way and pulleyed in such a way that when you pull down on the rope, you can see it makes that cradle cut again. And so theoretically, the pole pruner is a great way to prune small to medium-sized trees, all right, theoretically. The reality of the situation is if you take this pole and you put the extension on and try to hold it up and negotiate it through and get the branches, it becomes very difficult. The second type of pole pruner is, in essence, a pruning saw on the end of a pole. Now, oftentimes you can buy a pole pruner that has a telescoping mechanism. It has the pruner, the lopping shear on the end, as well as a pruning saw. Again, theoretically, the pruning saw on the end of a pole works great. However, if you hold it up over your head for any length of time, and then remember it cuts on the pull stroke, that could create, oh man, your shoulders get tired. It's a difficult way to prune. But you can get some minimal pruning done with the pole pruners. So that's about the tools that you would need to use. One more thing that I want to mention and we'll demonstrate out in the field, and that is, many of you may be asking about the pruning shears. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a pruner. This is a shearing instrument. This does not allow you to make selective cuts. If you're going to prune a formal hedge, you're actually not going to prune it, you're going to shear it. And you can see the kind of way it moves. It cuts indiscriminately through leaves, through stems, through buds, no selective pruning. And when we begin to talk about how to prune, we'll talk about the difference between selective pruning and non-selective pruning, which is very important for the success of the kind of pruning you'll do. So folks, there you have it. A number of different pruning tools, wonderful approach to pruning. You pick your tools based on the jobs you want to do, and don't forget about how big that branch should be so you don't damage your pruners. You know, oftentimes I find myself out in the garden with my pruners doing some pruning. Could be any time of the year. And invariably, a neighbor will come by and they'll say, hey, listen, I see you out there pruning. Is now a good time to prune? And I'll say, oh yeah, any time's a good time to prune. And they just don't seem to understand that. Well, you know, a lot of us don't really understand when is the best time to prune. So let's talk about that. When is the best time to prune? There's some basic principles that we need to make sure that we understand before we talk about the specifics of when. First of all, you can never hurt a plant by pruning it. Folks, there are no nerves in a plant. It has no central nervous system. The word hurt and the plant kingdom just don't go together. Now you might say, okay, fine, but what about damaging tissue? Well, research of woody plants has shown that the only time that tissue is damaged by pruning is when the wood is frozen. Now you notice I didn't say when the air is freezing, I said when the wood is frozen. Do you know what the temperature would have to be outside for the wood to be frozen? It would have to be way below zero for a long period of time for the wood tissue to actually be frozen. So basically what this is saying is there's no particular time that will cause great damage for pruning, because I know if you're like me, you're not going to be out pruning a tree or a shrub when the temperature is 20 below zero. Nobody in their right mind would do that. So we basically established the fact that you can prune any time. Now granted, there are some times that are better to prune than others. One, out of convenience, but two could also be if we're pruning valuable parts of the plant off. Now think about it. If you have a beautiful flowering plant and the flowers haven't opened yet, and you've chosen to go ahead and prune right before it flowers, well then what's going to happen is you're removing that very ornamental feature that you selected the plant for. The same goes for fruit. So we really need to develop an understanding for the sequencing of growth that occurs in plants. What do certain plants do first in the spring, then in late spring, summer, and fall? And then we'll know when is the best time to prune certain plants. So let's take a look. If we understand plant growth, then we become better selective pruners. First of all, there are a couple of categories of plants we want to identify. The first category is spring flowering. Folks, this is those types of plants that the very first growth activity they participate in the spring is they flower right away. Classic example, an azalea. What's the first thing an azalea does in the springtime? Well, it pops out flowers. Those buds were already there from the fall before. So basically, if we understand how spring flowering plants grow sequentially, we can then decide when the best time to prune. So here's a little sequence to remember. The first thing that a spring flowering plant does in the spring is it flowers. The second thing it does is it flushes. Now you might be going, what on earth is he talking about? Flushing. Anytime a woody ornamental plant puts out new vegetative growth, leaves and stems, that's referred to as a growth flush. We call that flushing. All right? So the spring flowering plant flowers first, then it flushes, and then after it finishes flushing, the spring flowering plant, the azalea for instance, will go ahead and set buds. It'll set buds. That means create flower buds for the following growing season. So an azalea is going to flower, it's going to flush, and then it's going to set buds. Conversely, the summer flowering plant, the crepe myrtle for instance, it's going to flush first in the spring. The very first growth activity that crepe myrtle has is a burst of vegetative growth, leaves and stems. Then following that flush will come the setting of the flower buds, and then following bud set, the plant will immediately flower. That's why you see a summer flowering plant like a crepe myrtle flowering in August and September, because it's gone through that sequencing. Now if we understand the sequencing, we can see where we insert the pruning activity. Let me show you what I mean. The best time to prune a spring flowering plant would be right before it flushes. Okay, now for an azalea, for instance, that translates into late spring. That azalea flowers, and then it gets ready to go ahead and flush. So for the spring flowering plants, the best time to prune them is right after they finish flowering, right before they flush. Okay, and in the case of those plants, late spring would be the appropriate time of year. Conversely, the summer flowering plants, you would also prune before flushing. But in this case, it's immediately before flushing, and in the case of the crepe myrtle, for instance, we'd be pruning in early spring before that vegetative growth comes out. That way we maximize the number of flowers and ultimately fruits we get on the plants. So you see, when to prune really becomes a function of their growth type. And lastly, here you see on the left a summer flowering plant which would be pruned in the early spring. There's a rhododendron which would be pruned in late spring. Some of you might be saying, what about plants that don't have flowers that I'm interested in? Well, then we have to remember for non-flowering plants, we prune before or after flushing. It's really a personal preference at that particular point. So there's the bottom line on when to prune. Well, our plant of the week this week was suggested to us by Ida Avent from Ellerby, North Carolina. Ida will be sending you an In the Garden t-shirt. Thanks for your suggestion. And folks, don't forget, make sure if you send in a suggestion and we use it on the air, we'll be sure to send you a t-shirt as well. Well, what's the plant of the week? Plant of the week is Pyracantha fortuniana graberi, Graber's pyracantha. But we're really talking about pyracanthas in general. A wonderful evergreen to semi-evergreen shrub that has white flowers in early spring, but the real ornamental feature, and you can see it right here, are the beautiful orange fruit that are produced late in the summer and into the fall. Now, what we're looking at is a specially trained kind of pyracantha. This is not the natural habit of this plant. No, this is called being pruned on a standard, and how appropriate that we be looking at a plant like this during our pruning show, where they've isolated one single stem and then pruned the top into a ball to highlight the foliage and the fruit. Now, this is done for formal landscapes. Can you imagine taking two of these plants, putting them in beautiful ornate pots, and placing them on either side of the front steps of the home for the fall and winter landscape to isolate the fruit and highlight the front of the home? This is a kind of a pruning method that really promotes formal landscapes. And you ought to think about where you might be able to use something like this on your patio. It's a great plant of the week, Pyracantha fortuniana graberi, Graber's pyracantha. Well, folks, we're about out of time for this week. So until next time, I'll be looking for you in the garden.
To register for In the Garden, the course, call NC State's Distance Education Program at 1-866-GO-STATE. That's 1-866-467-8283. Or log on to distance.ncsu.edu. For more information about the program or to suggest a plant of the week, go to unctv.org/inthegarden.
Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.